To love, the Duke said, raising his glass not to his wife of 20 years, but to the woman seated at his right hand, a woman who was not his wife at all. To the only comfort I have known in a marriage that gave me everything but happiness. The room did not gasp. Not yet. Because no one in that glittering hall had noticed the Duchess step through the doors behind him, her own anniversary gown catching the candlelight, her face very still. Before I tell you what she did in the 60 seconds that followed, 60 seconds that emptied a 200-year-old dukedom of every secret it had ever kept, I want to know something from you. If you walked into your own anniversary dinner and heard the man you had built a life with toast another woman in front of 40 witnesses, would you flee the room or would you lift your own glass? Tell me in the comments which one you would choose, and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. Subscribe if you believe the quiet ones always speak last and loudest, because what the Duchess said next did not simply end a toast. It ended a lie that had been eating her marriage alive for 3 years. But to understand how she came to stand in that doorway with such terrible calm, we must go back. Back before the Mistress. Back before the fraud. Back to a spring 19 years earlier, when Eleanor Hartley was not yet a duchess at all, only a girl with a dying father and a debt she did not yet know she would be asked to pay with the whole of her life. The Hartley house had once been a fine one. By the spring Eleanor turned 19, it was fine only in the way a portrait left too long in the sun is fine. The shape of grandeur still visible beneath the fading. Her father, a gentleman of old blood and older debts, had spent 2 decades mistaking hope for arithmetic, and by the time the physicians stopped pretending his cough would pass, the accounts were a ruin no science of prayer could mend. Eleanor did not learn of the extent of it from her father. She learned it from the tone of the tradesman at the door, from the way her mother's jewellery disappeared piece by piece from its box, from the particular silence that fell over the breakfast table whenever a letter arrived bearing a red wax seal. She was a quiet girl, and had always been thought a plain one, though this was less a fact than a habit of opinion in a family that reserved its admiration for her elder sister's laughter and her younger brother's cleverness. Eleanor kept the household ledgers from the age of 14 because no one else wished to, and in the keeping of them she had grown so exact, so unshowily capable, that by 19 she understood the family's ruin with a clarity her own father lacked. It was this exactness, not her face, not her fortune, for she had neither to spare, that first drew the attention of Edward Ashcombe, Duke of Ravenswood. He came to the county that spring ostensibly to inspect a parcel of disputed land his family had held since before the Civil War, though the county gossips preferred a more romantic theory involving a broken engagement in London the previous winter, a fiancé who had chosen a marquess's fortune over a duke's temper, and a young man determined never again to be a fool for affection. Whatever the truth of it, Edward Ashcombe arrived cold, correct, and entirely uninterested in the assembly room parade of eligible daughters trotted before him like prize mares. He noticed Eleanor Hartley precisely because she did not parade. She sat at the edge of her father's disintegrating drawing-room with a ledger open on her knee, correcting a column of figures the family solicitor had gotten wrong, and when the Duke, bored, restless, already regretting the visit, asked her bluntly what she was doing, she did not simper or blush. She told him, in plain terms, exactly how much the estate was worth, exactly how little remained of it, and exactly how many months remained before the roof itself became the family's chief creditor. He had never in his life heard a woman speak of ruin without either weeping or flirting over it. He found, to his own irritation, that he could not stop thinking of her. What followed was not courtship in any sense the county understood it. It was negotiation, conducted with a dry, careful honesty on both sides that neither ever admitted was its own kind of intimacy. The Duke needed a wife of good blood and steady character to satisfy an aging grandmother's will, which threatened the whole of the Ravenswood fortune to a distant cousin should he remain unmarried past 30. Eleanor's father needed, quite simply, salvation, and had precious little time left in which to secure it. And Eleanor herself, sitting across from a duke 12 years her senior in a drawing-room lit by a single candle because they could no longer afford two, understood, with the same unsentimental clarity she brought to a ledger, that this was the only arithmetic that would save her mother and her younger brother from the workhouse gate. She said yes, not because she loved him. She said yes because she had done the sums, and there was no other column that balanced. It surprised them both in the years that followed how close they came to love regardless. The wedding itself was modest, hurried by her father's failing health, held in the small stone chapel at Ravenswood rather than in London, where the Duke's mother would have preferred a spectacle. On the morning of it, the old Dowager Duchess, Edward's grandmother, a formidable woman not given to sentiment, pressed into Eleanor's hands a small velvet box. Inside lay a sapphire pendant, deep and clouded as a winter sea, set in silver gone soft with age. Every Duchess of Ravenswood has worn this on her wedding day for 4 generations, the old woman said, fastening the clasp herself with fingers that trembled slightly. It is said the stone dims when its wearer is unhappy and brightens when she is loved. I have never put much stock in old wives' superstition. But I will tell you this, child, you are the first bride to walk into this family for love of no one's fortune but your own family's survival. And I think that honesty will serve you better than any of the beauties your husband might have chosen instead. Eleanor wore the sapphire that day, and every anniversary after, though she never once, in 19 years of marriage, allowed herself to fully believe the old woman's superstition. And yet she noticed, though she told no one, that in the early years the stone did seem to catch a particular warmth in candlelight that she could not entirely explain by science. The early years were, against every arithmetic she had done, happy ones. Edward Ashcombe was not a warm man by nature, but he was an honest one. And Eleanor's own quiet competence, the way she reordered the estate's chaotic accounts within a year, the way she treated the tenants' complaints as matters of genuine consequence rather than tedious interruption, the way she never once, in all their private hours, asked him for anything beyond what he freely wished to give, earned from him something the county had not thought him capable of: devotion. He began, in the 2nd year of their marriage, to seek her opinion before making decisions about the estate. By the 4th year, he had stopped seeking anyone else's. Their daughter, Alice, was born in the 5th year, a bright, gap-toothed child who from her earliest years trailed after her father through the stables and the home farm with an adoration that made even the Duke's stern face soften into something the servants had never seen before her. For a decade, the marriage that had begun as an act of arithmetic became, by slow and unremarked degrees, something neither of them had dared to hope for. Eleanor believed in those years that she had done more than balance a column. She believed she had built a life. It was in the 12th year of the marriage that Silas Price came to Ravenswood, and though no one thought to mark the date at the time, it was the true beginning of everything that followed. He arrived with excellent references and a manner so smooth it seemed almost a physical texture, recommended to the Duke by a London acquaintance as a man who could modernise an estate's finances the way the new railways were modernising the countryside. Eleanor had managed the household accounts capably for a decade, but the wider estate, the tenant rents, the timber sales, the investments the Duke had begun making in canal shares and northern mills had grown too vast for any one person to oversee without a trained steward, and so Price was engaged as the estate's man of business, with an office in the East Wing and, within a season, an authority over the Ravenswood ledgers that rivalled the Duke's own. He was, Eleanor thought from their first meeting, a man who smiled with his mouth and calculated with his eyes, though she said nothing of this instinct to her husband, who found Price's manner efficient and his figures impeccable. It would be 3 years before she learned how carefully those figures had been made to lie. The second stranger arrived the following spring, at a house party the Duke's mother, before her death the previous winter, had left Edward the sole authority of the house, had once insisted upon, and which Eleanor, out of respect for the old woman's memory, continued each year, though she took little pleasure in it. Among the guests that year was Lady Cordelia Vane, the widowed daughter of an impoverished baron, celebrated across 3 counties for a beauty that seemed lit from within and a wit sharp enough to draw blood while smiling. She arrived at Ravenswood as the guest of a minor cousin, and left 4 days later with an invitation to return that the Duke himself had extended over Eleanor's quiet, unspoken reservation. Eleanor could not, in that first meeting, have named what troubled her about Lady Cordelia beyond the ordinary discomfort any wife might feel at a husband's evident interest in a beautiful stranger's conversation. Edward was not, in those years, a man given to impropriety, and Eleanor trusted him with the same steady faith she brought to everything else in her life. It did not occur to her, watching Cordelia Vane laugh at something her husband had said across the dinner table, that she was watching the opening move of a campaign that had, in truth, already begun. For nearly 2 years the change crept so slowly that Eleanor could not have marked the day it began. Edward's visits to his study grew longer, his consultations with Price more frequent and more private. Invitations to town multiplied, and increasingly he attended them without her, citing the tedium of business she would find dull. Lady Cordelia's name began to appear, with a regularity Eleanor told herself was coincidence, in the same guest lists, the same drawing rooms, the same theatre boxes her husband now favoured. Eleanor was not a jealous woman by temperament, and she distrusted her own unease as much as she distrusted gossip, and so for a long while she said nothing, watched carefully, and continued to run the household with the same steady competence that had first won her husband's respect. It was this very steadiness, she would later understand, that made her so easy to overlook. A woman who does not complain is a woman whose complaints, when at last she makes them, are the easiest of all to dismiss as hysteria or jealousy dressed in respectable language. Price and Cordelia, whatever the precise nature of their arrangement, and Eleanor would not learn its full architecture until much later, had between them a gift for reading exactly which people in a household could be trusted to stay silent and which could not. The midpoint of it all, the moment Eleanor's quiet trust cracked open into quiet suspicion, came on an ordinary Tuesday in the estate office, when she went looking for a rent receipt from a tenant farmer, old Mr. Aldous, who had come to the kitchen door insisting he had paid his quarter's due, and been told by Price's clerk that no such payment was recorded. Eleanor, who still kept a private set of household books out of old habit even after Price's arrival, went to the estate ledger to settle the matter, and found, tucked between 2 pages that did not quite match the ink of the surrounding entries, a torn corner of paper, the remnant of a page that had been removed. She said nothing to Price. She said nothing to her husband. She simply began, in the quiet hours after the household slept, to compare the figures Price reported to Edward each quarter against the actual rents collected, against the timber sold, against the dividends the Northern Mill investments ought by rights to have returned. The discrepancies, once she began truly looking, were not small. Over 3 years, sums that should have swelled the Ravenswood coffers had instead vanished into accounts she could not trace, disguised beneath a dozen small falsifications so carefully constructed that no casual audit would have caught them. She understood, with the same unsentimental clarity that had once told her exactly how many months remained before her father's roof collapsed, that Silas Price was robbing her husband quietly and systematically, and had been for years. She might, perhaps, have gone to Edward with this discovery at once, had the second discovery not arrived within the same fortnight to complicate everything. Searching the estate office for further proof of the missing funds, Eleanor found, folded inside a ledger she had assumed contained nothing but grain accounts. A letter that was not in Price's hand at all, but in a looping, confident script she recognized from correspondence Lady Cordelia had once sent regarding the house party guest list. The letter was not addressed to the Duke. It was addressed to Price, and it spoke, in language too careful to be called a confession, but too specific to be called innocent, of keeping his attention comfortably occupied while the accounts are settled, of an arrangement in which Cordelia's continued presence in the Duke's confidence served some purpose Price required for reasons the letter did not name outright, but which Eleanor, reading it twice by candlelight with her hands very still, understood well enough. Her husband's affections had not simply wandered. They had been cultivated deliberately and with purpose as cover for a fraud that would otherwise have been far harder to conceal from a duke whose attention was, by every account, entirely elsewhere. Eleanor did not weep over that letter, though she sat with it a long while in the dark. She had never been a woman who wept where weeping accomplished nothing, and something colder and more useful than grief was already beginning to move in her. The same instinct that had once told a dying father's daughter exactly how to save a household from ruin. But she was, for the first time in her marriage, entirely alone in what she knew, and she understood with a clarity that frightened her that she could prove none of it yet in a way that would survive her husband's evident affection for the woman who had caused it. A wife's suspicion, unsupported, is worth nothing against a duke's own eyes. She would need more than a torn ledger page and an ambiguous letter before she dared speak a single word of what she had found. She did not have the luxury of gathering that proof slowly, because within the month the campaign against her, for campaign it was, though she did not yet fully grasp its scale, began in earnest. It started with small cruelties disguised as ordinary society. At a ball in the county town, Lady Cordelia contrived, with a skill Eleanor could only privately admire even as it wounded her, to draw the Duke into conversation for the better part of an hour while positioning herself so that every observer in the room would note it, and would note also the Duchess standing alone near the refreshment table, unclaimed by her own husband for a single dance. It was the sort of slight that could not be objected to without seeming petty, precisely calibrated to leave Eleanor with no dignified recourse but silence. Whispers began, as whispers do, from nowhere anyone could name, that the Duchess had grown cold to her husband, that the marriage had long ago settled into mere arrangement, that the Duke, poor man, sought comfort where he could find warmth. Eleanor recognized, with growing alarm, the particular cruelty of a rumour built to excuse the very betrayal that had caused it. Worse followed. A letter arrived at Ravenswood in Eleanor's own hand, or so it appeared, the forgery careful enough that even Eleanor, examining it later, admired the skill of it with a kind of horrified detachment, addressed to a gentleman of the county with whom Eleanor had exchanged nothing more than pleasantries at church, containing language of an intimacy she had never written and would never have countenanced. The letter found its way with suspicious precision not to its supposed recipient but into the hands of the Duke's own valet, and from there inevitably to the Duke himself. Edward did not confront her outright. He was too proud, and perhaps too uncertain of his own conscience by then, for so direct a reckoning. But Eleanor felt the change in him, as one feels a change in weather before the storm itself arrives. A new formality in his address to her. A withdrawal from the small evening rituals of 19 years of marriage. A coldness that no explanation she might have offered could have thawed, because he never gave her the chance to offer one. She understood, watching her husband's face grow distant across their own dinner table, that she was watching a man being carefully, deliberately turned against her by two people who required his distraction and his distrust in equal measure, and that to accuse them without proof would only confirm, in his eyes, the very portrait of a jealous, unstable wife that the forged letter had already begun to paint. The dark hour, when it came, arrived not as a single blow, but as a long, grinding erosion that left Eleanor, by the time their 20th anniversary approached, hollowed in a way 3 years of quiet fraud and cruelty had accomplished more thoroughly than any single betrayal could have. Edward informed her of the anniversary dinner arrangements with the same brisk formality he now used for estate business, and Eleanor learned only by overhearing the housekeeper's instructions to the kitchen that Lady Cordelia Vane had been included among the guest list. Not merely included, but seated, at the Duke's specific direction, near the head of the table, in a place of honour Eleanor herself had occupied at every anniversary of their marriage. She went to her husband's study that evening to ask him directly whether this was truly his wish, and found the door closed against her for the first time in 19 years of marriage, Price's low voice audible through the wood, discussing accounts requiring the Duke's personal attention that Eleanor now understood, with bitter clarity, to be nothing of the sort. She stood a long moment in the corridor outside that closed door, the old sapphire pendant cold against her collarbone, and felt, for the first time since she had been a girl, watching tradesmen turn away from her father's unpaid door, entirely without recourse. It was Mrs. Whitcomb, the housekeeper who had served the Ravenswood family since before Edward's own birth, who found the Duchess sitting alone in the unlit morning room an hour later, the sapphire still clutched in one hand as though she meant to tear it from her throat. Mrs. Whitcomb was not a woman given to overstepping her place. But 19 years of quiet loyalty had earned her the right to speak plainly when plain speaking was required. "Your Grace," she said, setting down her candle and taking a seat uninvited beside her mistress, "I have watched you hold this house together with your own 2 hands since before that man's daughter could walk. And I have watched Mr. Price's ledgers grow fatter while the tenants' cottages grow colder, and I am not such a fool as to think those 2 things unconnected. Whatever you are carrying alone, Your Grace, you need not carry it alone any longer." It was the first kindness offered without agenda that Eleanor had received in months, and it broke something loose in her that grief alone had not managed to break. Not despair, but its opposite. Resolve, what followed in the 6 weeks remaining before the anniversary dinner, was not the work of a wounded wife, but of the same exacting, unshowy competence that had first drawn a duke's attention to a girl correcting figures in a ruined drawing-room 19 years before. Eleanor wrote, that same week, to her younger brother Thomas, now a barrister of some standing in London, whose cleverness their family had once favoured so openly over her own quiet usefulness, and who arrived at Ravenswood within the fortnight, prepared to apply that cleverness at last in his sister's service rather than at her expense. Together, working in the hours after the household slept, they reconstructed 3 years of falsified accounts against the true rent rolls Eleanor had quietly maintained. Against bank records Thomas obtained through a former Cambridge acquaintance now employed at the very institution where Price had been diverting the estate's funds. Against the testimony, gathered carefully and at real personal risk, by Mrs. Whitcomb, who knew every servant's loyalty and every tenant's grievance better than any account book could record, of no fewer than 11 tenants whose rents had been quietly raised on Price's private authority while the estate's official records showed no increase at all, the difference pocketed directly. Old Mr. Aldous, whose missing receipt had first opened Eleanor's eyes to the fraud, gave his testimony gladly, glad at last to be believed. Even the family's long-time solicitor, elderly Mr. Godfrey, who had drawn up the Ravenswood settlements at Eleanor's own wedding, was quietly consulted and confirmed upon examining the ledgers that the pattern of falsification was, in his considerable experience, unmistakable and criminal. The letter that had first revealed Cordelia's arrangement with Price, Eleanor kept always upon her person, along with 2 further letters Thomas's careful inquiries uncovered. One from Price to a London moneylender, revealing the scale of debts he had accumulated and clearly intended to satisfy from the stolen funds. And one, most damning of all, in which Cordelia herself, grown careless in her confidence, had written to a confidante of her design to secure the Duke's full trust before the year is out. Whatever the cost to that colourless little wife of his, words Eleanor read only once in Thomas's presence, and did not permit herself to read again before the dinner. For she required, that night above all others, a steadiness she did not trust grief to leave intact. By the week of the anniversary, she possessed not suspicion but proof, exact, documented, witnessed proof of the kind no drawing-room rumour could withstand, and she possessed, too, a plan for exactly how and when to use it, born of the same patient arithmetic that had once saved her family from ruin. She would not confront her husband privately, where Price and Cordelia might yet talk their way free of what she knew. She would wait for the one evening on which the truth could be spoken before every witness whose good opinion mattered to a duke. and whose good opinion Price and Cordelia had spent 3 years so carefully manipulating for their own protection. The night of the anniversary arrived cold and very clear, the sort of crisp autumn evening in which every star seemed close enough to touch, and Ravenswood Hall blazed with candlelight from every window, as though the house itself understood the significance of the date, whatever its mistress's private grief. Eleanor dressed that evening with more care than she had given her appearance in months, choosing a gown of deep midnight blue that had been made for her at her husband's own request 3 years before, in happier days, and fastening at her throat the old sapphire pendant the Dowager Duchess had given her on her wedding morning. She did not know, dressing before her glass with Mrs. Whitcomb's steady hands, helping with the clasp, whether the old superstition about the stone dimming with unhappiness held any truth at all. But she noted, with something between grim humour and genuine feeling, that if it did, the stone had every reason that night to have gone entirely dark. She arrived deliberately late to the great dining hall, later than a hostess ought, because she had learned enough of Price's methods by then to suspect precisely what use he and Cordelia intended to make of the moments before her arrival. She was not wrong. Standing in the shadow of the hall's great doorway, unseen by the 40 guests already seated at the long candlelit table, Eleanor watched her husband rise to his feet, glass in hand. His eyes fixed not upon the empty chair reserved at his right for his wife of 20 years, but upon the woman seated in it instead, Lady Cordelia Vane, resplendent in ivory silk, her expression composed into a mask of modest surprise entirely undercut by the triumph visible beneath it to anyone who troubled to look closely, which no one in that glittering room, dazzled by wine and candlelight and the Duke's evident sincerity, thought to do. "To love," Edward said, his voice carrying easily down the length of the table, and Eleanor felt the words land in her like stones dropped one by one into still water. "To the only comfort I have known in a marriage that gave me everything but happiness." A ripple of uncertain laughter moved through the guests, the kind offered when no one is quite certain whether they have understood a jest correctly, and Price, seated further down the table, allowed himself the smallest, most satisfied smile Eleanor had ever seen a man wear over the ruin of another. It was, she understood in that instant, meant to be the final act, a public humiliation so total, so witnessed, that no dignity would remain for her to salvage, and no one remaining in that room would ever again question why the Duke's affections had settled elsewhere. Eleanor did not run. She did not weep, and she did not falter in the doorway a moment longer than it took her to draw one steady breath. She walked the length of that long candlelit table with a composure that later guests would describe, in the retelling, as almost frightening in its calm, and she did not stop until she stood directly beside her husband's chair, close enough that the Duke, glass still raised, turned at last to find his wife's eyes upon him rather than the woman he had been toasting. The room fell silent by degrees, the way a held breath falls silent, as one guest and then another noticed the Duchess standing where the Duchess ought, by every rule of the house, to have been seated all along. "Finish it then," Eleanor said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that hushed hall with a clarity that silenced even the servants at the sideboard. "Finish your toast, Edward. Tell this room precisely what marriage gave you everything but happiness, the marriage that paid for the roof over Lady Cordelia's own family estate 3 winters ago." When her father's creditors came calling, and it was Ravenswood funds, quietly diverted through Mr. Price's very capable hands, that settled the debt in exchange for her presence here tonight. A gasp moved through the room like wind through wheat, and Eleanor did not pause to let it settle. She drew from the small reticule at her wrist the folded letters she had carried against her heart for a fortnight, and set them upon the table before her husband with a steadiness that cost her more than anyone in that room would ever fully know. You need not take my word for any of it. Take Mr. Godfrey's, who examined these accounts at my request and found 3 years of falsified ledgers bearing Mr. Price's own hand. Take the word of 11 tenants of this estate, whose rents were raised in secret and whose money lines Mr. Price's own pockets even now. Seated at this table, eating from your grandmother's silver. And take, if you require it, Lady Cordelia's own words, written in her own hand, describing her design to secure your trust, her words, Edward, whatever the cost to your, and I quote her precisely, colourless little wife. The silence that followed was total. Edward Ashcombe, Duke of Ravenswood, stood with his glass still raised and his face gone the colour of old ash, staring at the letters upon the table as though they might yet prove some trick of firelight rather than the ruin of every certainty he had built for himself over 3 careful years. Lady Cordelia rose halfway from her chair, some protest already forming on her lips, and found it die there entirely as Thomas Hartley, seated unobtrusively near the foot of the table where he had waited the whole evening for precisely this moment, rose in turn and addressed the room in the calm, carrying voice of a man well practised in courtrooms. "I would advise Lady Vane to remain seated," he said. "The Bow Street men Mr. Godfrey summoned earlier this evening are waiting in the servants' hall even now, and I do not think either she or Mr. Price will find their exit from this house quite so graceful as their entrance to it 3 years ago." Price, to his credit or his cowardice, made no attempt at protest at all, only sat very still with the particular stillness of a man calculating, too late, that every avenue of escape had already been sealed. What followed in the hour after was a scene the county would speak of for a generation, the Duke's face as he read, in silence broken only by the crackle of the fire, letter after letter, proving a betrayal not merely of his marriage, but of his household, his tenants, and his own judgment, Lady Cordelia's composure cracking at last into something closer to the truth of her, shrill and accusing and entirely unconvincing before a room now armed with proof. Price led from the hall between 2 constables with the ledgers Eleanor and Thomas had so carefully reconstructed carried behind him as evidence. The guests, 40 strong, watching a marriage they had believed dead reveal itself, in its final act, to have been the only honest thing at that table all along. Edward did not speak to his wife at once. He set down the untouched glass of wine still in his hand, and for a long moment simply looked at her, at the sapphire at her throat, which caught the candlelight, she would later be told by more than one guest, with a brightness none of them had ever seen it hold before, as though seeing her for the first time in 3 long years of careful blindness. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice, when it came, held none of the coldness of the past months, only something raw and unrehearsed that the room had certainly never heard from the Duke of Ravenswood before. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," she answered, "to understand that proving it would matter more than accusing it. I did not want your belief, Edward, I wanted your certainty. A wife's word against a mistress's charm is worth nothing in this world. Evidence, it turns out, is worth everything. It was not forgiveness, not yet, and she did not offer it as such. Standing there with the letters still spread upon the table between them and 40 witnesses to a humiliation that had been, until minutes before, entirely his own design turned against him. But it was, she would say later to Mrs. Whitcomb in the quiet of her own chamber, the truest thing she had said to her husband in 3 years, and it opened in the weeks that followed. A conversation neither of them had believed themselves capable of having, one built not on old affection assumed and taken for granted, but on the same unsentimental honesty that had first brought them together across a ruined drawing-room 19 years before. Silas Price stood trial the following spring for embezzlement on a scale that ruined what remained of his reputation entirely. The testimony of 11 tenants and the ledgers Eleanor had painstakingly reconstructed, leaving no juror any real doubt of his guilt. He was transported, in the end, for a term of years that satisfied even the county's appetite for scandal. Lady Cordelia Vane found no husband willing to overlook the letters that had, despite Eleanor's discretion, found their way eventually into wider circulation among the ton, and she left England within the year for the continent, where her name, stripped of the fortune Price's fraud could no longer provide, opened considerably fewer doors than it once had. Edward Ashcombe spent that winter in a manner the servants at Ravenswood had never before witnessed from their master, attending with genuine and unglamorous diligence to every tenant whose rent had been secretly raised, restoring to each family from his own private funds every shilling Price had stolen and more besides, and appearing each evening at his wife's side, not from habit or arrangement but, it became increasingly clear to a household that watched such things closely, from a devotion he had very nearly thrown away and did not intend to risk losing twice. It was 2 years after that anniversary dinner, on a warm evening when their daughter Alice, grown taller and sharper-eyed with every season, sat between them at the same long table now set for a far smaller and far happier gathering, that Edward rose again with a glass in hand, and Eleanor, watching him from her rightful place at his side, felt no flicker of the old dread. "To my wife," he said simply, without ornament, without the practised flourish he had once reserved for rooms he wished to impress, who built this house twice over, once with her arithmetic and once with her courage, and who taught me, at no small cost to herself, the difference between a marriage kept for comfort and a marriage kept for truth. I do not deserve the second chance she gave me. I mean to spend what remains of my life proving myself worthy of it regardless. Eleanor lifted her own glass then, the old sapphire bright and steady at her throat in the candlelight, and did not need the Dowager Duchess's superstition to tell her what every person in that smaller, warmer room could plainly see for themselves, that a love built on honesty, however hard won, burned a great deal brighter than one built on silence ever could have. The tenants of Ravenswood, in the years that followed, spoke often of the quiet Duchess who had once stood alone in a doorway and finished her husband's toast for him, and they told the story always the same way, not as a tale of a wife wronged, but as a tale of a woman who had never once needed anyone's permission to speak the truth of her own life, in her own voice, at her own table, precisely when it mattered most.